Well, it's that time of the year again when world leaders gather together to talk about one of the leading challenges of our times, climate change. COP28 is being held in Dubai and Prime Minister Narendra Modi reiterated India's stand at the forum. At a time when developing nations are unfairly asked to cut down on fossil fuel usage by those who have already exhausted them, Prime Minister Modi put out India's response. He said that despite being 17% of the global population, India contributes less than 4% to global carbon emissions. PM Modi also urged developed nations to fully reduce carbon footprint by 2050.
फ्रेंड्स, आज भारत ने इकोलॉजी और इकोनॉमी के उत्तम संतुलन का उदाहरण विश्व के सामने रखा है। भारत में विश्व की 17% आबादी होने के बावजूद ग्लोबल कार्बन एमिशंस में हमारी हिस्सेदारी ओनली 4% से भी कम है। भारत विश्व की उन कुछ इकोनॉमीज में से एक है जो एनडीसी टारगेट्स को पूरा करने की राह पर है।
Now, the Prime Minister also launched the Green Credit Initiative at COP28. Here's what it's all about. It basically focuses on making carbon sinks like forests, fertile soil and mangroves, basically anything that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere. A benchmark is set to award green credit to each of these activities, and then these are incentivized for individuals, groups or organizations, whoever the stakeholder is. Now, one of the major tussles between developed and developing nations has been climate finance. A loss and damage fund has been created, which aims to financially assist, rescue and rehabilitate countries facing the cascading effects of climate change. Now, those who are expected to pay up are the rich nations who have become developed at the expense of the environment. As per research, 55 vulnerable countries have suffered losses to the tune of more than $525 billion in the last 20 years. The number is estimated to reach $580 billion per year by 2030. Not just financial loss, climate crisis has also created what are known as climate migrants, those who are forced to leave their homes due to extreme weather events. South Asia, Latin America and Africa have been the most vulnerable regions. By 2050, about 143 million people are estimated to be displaced. The larger question remains, how many COPs would it take for us to see concrete changes on ground? Joining me on the show today, Suresh Goyal, former ambassador, and Vimlendu, he's an environmentalist. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for speaking with Mirror Now. Welcome to both of you. Vimlendu, I'd like to start with you. How ironic do you find the fact that COP28 this year is being held in a nation which is also one of the top oil-producing countries of the world?
Absolutely, Shreya, and you've seen the documents that have come out in public domain in last 2 weeks where, the proponents of COP28 or the so-called leaders of COP28 have actually been, under the table trying to actually push for oil deals in that sense. So it's very, very ironic. It's like, how Coca-Cola last time was the sponsor of climate debate, and now we have an oil nation or oil company telling us that let's really have a better climate. So it's very, very ironic. And irony doesn't really end at the host nation or a sponsor company in that sense. Reality is where India has a very, very strong point that the 7 most richest countries or the historical polluters of the world, which primarily means America, Europe and other countries, they've really not been able to do enough or are not really committed to put the money where the actual climate finance has to be. For last several COPs that we've seen, they've copped out. They've not put, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about COP negotiations, it's primarily about two things. We're talking about technology transfer and we talk about finance. With regard to finance, there were commitments made earlier. The Trump administration actually blocked it. Many other countries. So, one is to say that per capita carbon footprint of India is very, very low. But the first world, the historical polluters, want to put the blame on India and China. And that's where the objection is. That indeed, India and China's per capita carbon footprint is low, but overall they come to be the largest emitters in that sense. But historical polluters also has a responsibility, and therefore it only ends up becoming a large cocktail evening and gatherings. As in, COPs on environment have become very, very strong over the last couple of years, but nothing comes out of it. And the fact that rather on coal, on fossil, or on oil, there's no negotiation. There's nothing, unfortunately, that comes out of this.
Yeah. Ambassador Suresh Goyal, one of the major tussles in this climate crisis around the world has been between the developed countries and the developing countries when it comes to climate finance and, as Vimlendu said, the accountability part of it. The developed nations have become developed, have developed their economies at the expense of environment, and now the expectation is that those who are trying to strengthen their economy are supposed to follow the rules that they have laid down and perhaps they have exploited in the past several decades. But, with the kind of climate finance talks that happened this time around this year at COP28, and the Prime Minister also launched the Green Credit Initiative, we have the Damage and Loss Fund there. How much of an impact do you think it's going to make?
Where the whole stage of negotiations reminds me of a Shakespearean comedy, or a tragedy, if you wish to call it really. You have all these developed and the developing countries coming together year after year, making commitments after commitments to discuss something and to talk about something which shows no sign of abating whatsoever. Since COP27 till today, when the COP28 is taking place, the sea levels have risen further. Glaciers in the Antarctic are melting. Only 2 days ago, there was a report about heavy meltdowns. The penguins are leaving Antarctica, they're coming south. So where is it all leading up to? Only today, you talk about the loss and damage funds. The loss and damage funds, the United Arab Emirates, the president of COP28, gives an estimate of requirement of at least $100 billion every year. Every year, $100 billion fund in that. The requirement of the funds by the countries from here is estimated to be a total of $500 billion over a certain number of years. And if you compare that with the contributions it received today after inauguration, $490 million, $500 million, and having worked in the United Nations and through my own experience, if on the first day it is $500 million, I don't think the total contribution is going to go up beyond $1.5 or $2 billion over the whole year. Compare the contributions which countries have made. USA, $17.5 million. Can you imagine? United Arab Emirates is making $100 million, and the first power of the world, USA, which probably has been one of the foremost in causing the environmental degradation because of the energy intensive development, as like the whole Europe has been, contributes only $17.5 billion. I think it's shameful, really. They talk a lot.
But who's going to call them out, Ambassador Goyal?
And
Who's,
again, I
who's
call
going
to
to call
question
them
the
out? Who's going to make these developed countries accountable?
we 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 have to call them out. The developing countries have to call them out and tell them that you give this huge slogan of common good. But where is the common responsibility? Where is the differentiated responsibility? You have huge capacity. But whenever there is a question of technology transfer, USA says, oh, that is in the hands of the private companies. You can't force them. So you can force a developing country not to transition and then accuse them later on that they're not doing enough. But you can't compel your own companies to part with the technology. I think it's unbelievable. And that's the reason I call it a comedy. It's a Shakespearean comedy, really, where everybody is blaming others. I was giving the example of India. On the other hand, a developing country, India, goes beyond its possible means to make NDCs which are unfulfillable. We are talking about net zero by 2070. Do you know the amount of investment that will be required in the transition? 200 trillion dollars. $200 trillion. Our GDP itself is not even $5 trillion at the moment. How are we going to possibly do it? We want to be actually 45% reduction in our intensity. How much money are we going to need? How much savings? Our GDP cannot afford that kind of saving. So if we can't do it, maybe we will try and make a commitment. But eventually, if we want to develop, China was the most energy intensive developing economy. China has already gone far ahead to an extent that we will probably take 50 years to catch up with it. And in the meantime, we are supposed to really cut down on our energy consumption, and which basically means that we cut down on our development. So climate negotiation becomes a means of the developed countries to maintain their lead. Yes.
Yeah. Vimlendu Jha, I've just received news actually about a flash flood occurring in Kenya, where at least 40,000 people have been displaced from their homes since rains began in October. And this is just one of the numbers, one of the stats that we get of what we now and whom we now know as climate migrants. And it is so sad that it's not as if the world didn't have more problems, that we have one more added challenge of climate migrants who have to flee their homes, who are displaced from their own homes due to extreme weather events happening. How do you really, carve your way through this? What's the solution really? And how tragic is it that people have to move out of their house just because of extreme weather events happening around the area?
Shreya, there are people moving out of their homes in Kenya, and there are people moving out of their homes in Chennai as we speak, in our own country, closer to my home and your studio. And the fact that for 15 or 17 or 19 days, the entire country was talking about a tunnel collapse in Uttarakhand, that's also not a climate event, but a climate neglect event that we are talking about. So, when we say that what's happening in Kenya in terms of floods, the kind of temperature rise that has happened in Europe and America, or everything else. In fact, the Center for Science and Environment came up with a report yesterday that said that last 9 months in India, we've had a climate event every day. So we've almost become used to it, by the way. And you and I were talking about air pollution some time ago. Air quality is severe. So, when you keep normalizing something like air pollution, or we keep normalizing a flood in Chennai, that December mein to hota hi hai, or for that matter, a flood in Kenya, that's the problem with these COPs that we're talking about. When the world leaders actually go there and talk about these big things, but they don't talk about the domestic issues. Reality is that when the Prime Minister Modi goes to UAE and talks about climate sink, but look at the amount of forest that's been actually cut in our country. 56,000 trees, 600 hectares of India's forest or Himalayas forest were compromised for that one project that we're talking about. So one is to really grandstand at a global stage, which India does and every other country does, but doesn't really fulfill their climate commitment. Reality is that none of the countries, none of the political leaders are actually committed to really understand climate change, or perhaps they understand climate change, but they're so much bound by economic development, economic or development, because a lot of times you and I have spoken that development is more important and it's okay to compromise the environment. And that's exactly what is happening right now. Like, why is Chennai being flooded, or why is Uttarakhand being flooded, or why is, when we talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees threshold, reality is that somewhere the norms of our development are not followed, where we actually are emitting much, much more. So, when we get into this, I, of course, a lot of times hold the rich countries, the developed countries, the historical polluters responsible, and of course they need to pay for it, pay for historically what they've done in terms of finance and in terms of technology transfer. But countries like India also have a responsibility. India cannot say that, well, we are phasing out of coal and their investment in coal keeps increasing. So, there's a lot of double standards that we're talking about. Like, in the month of November,
but Vimlendu, that's where the argument of the fact that why should we cut down on anything when we are trying to develop, when we are striving to strengthen our economy, when we are trying to become a developed nation, why are you stopping us?
Shreya,
why is the United States not stopping?
But Shreya, I only want to add one thing. But Shreya, I only want to add one point here, that when India takes a stand that we have a right to grow, we need to understand that India's rich has a right to grow. Most of the development that we are actually doing, when we talk about per capita energy need of India, is it of the poor or the rich? So we every time we go to the world stage, we ask for the poorest of the poor. But every time we use our energy, we use it for the richest. We are not using our energy equity or our share for the poor. We use it for the rich. That bridge or the fancy flyover, I'm not even talking 2 hours of electricity in a remote village. That's our need of a poor Indian. That's the aspirational India's per capita carbon requirement or ambition. But when India puts forth, India is really in a bad space right now in terms of environment, is not because it wants to really grow its poor. It wants to grow its rich, and that's the problem. Indian Americans in that sense, in the sense, the richest of the rich of India are the polluters of India, and that's what it is. So an average American, the footprint of an average American and footprint of a very, very rich Indian is the same. So in the name of poor, we cannot always be negotiating these fancy flyovers and airports and roads and things that we're building, and in that process, cutting down our forests in the name of the poor, in the name of developing nation, that can be okay in UAE, can okay be in COP. Anyway, Americans and the others are not interested in being just and equitable, because they have not paid and they'll not pay, because they just want to put the responsibility in population rather than on per capita carbon footprint that they have, because they're saying is American way of living is more important than saving the planet. So of course I don't want to talk about America,
that American
but
way
forget
of
about
living
climate
also is
change
quite
being a global
interesting
debate. Climate change is local.
Yeah, they keep
It's local.
The fact that climate change is local and therefore it needs local solutions. Yes,
is affecting me.
Yeah, you're right. And, you talked about the American way of living. And what's interesting is that the tiniest of our actions would help us battle climate change. And clearly, something as tiny as the use and throw concept that goes around American way of living would have actually a major impact when we talk about tackling climate change and, balancing the environment. And I want to put also that visual on our screens. I'd request my producer to put that Tuvalu minister who stood there in the middle of the sea at COP26 and gave out that message that small island nations are drowning and that rich nations need to do something about it. That was a powerful message that smaller countries gave in. But what are the rich nations doing? Well, there's nothing on ground yet. There's no change yet. Ambassador Goyal, last question to you. We've seen diplomacy at its best at COP28 as well. Another year of COP seeing a lot of good photo ops, diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi also had some bilateral meetings. He met several leaders, global leaders on the sidelines of COP28. How much of this diplomacy would actually translate on ground and lead to some concrete actions?
Difficult to say really, because we always have expectations and we always believe in when the leaders say that it's a common good for the humanity. So we all need to work in the direction, but the problem really comes up that eventually when it's a time for translation of all these announcements and decisions into practice, then the narrow national interests come in the way, particularly for those countries. And the fact is that I'm not even talking about the ideology like the Vimlendu does. Ideology is not part of my survival. My survival really is that I don't want to drown in these untimely floods and I don't want to be caught up in the hurricanes. I'm living in Greater Noida where there is huge air pollution outside necessitated by changing crop patterns. So anyway, the point really here is financing of this transition is very, very important. I think we need to avoid giving an impression that it can be the practice as usual, the game as usual. The developed world has to be put on warning now that unless there are funds, it is not going to happen, and that you will suffer along with us. It's not only us. You are looking for the markets in the developing countries, but your industries will suffer unless you pay up. We need to put that out very, very clearly. Number two, and that's very important, I think our strategies of development have to be sustainable development strategies where we become less energy consumer, less energy intensive kind of production techniques, and that can happen. It can be done, provided we pay attention to the fact that it is not always the heavy industry, the big industry that comes in the way. So we need to have the right kind of consumption, right kind of production and fund transfers, which are the, I think, three most important parts of it really.
Okay. I'll wrap up there. I think it's election season. It's best to say that one of the factors that can push our local political parties to actually act on climate change is by putting it on their manifesto, and for us voters to make sure that they are acting on those promises that they make, if they make, on battling climate crisis. Vimlendu Jha and Ambassador Suresh Goyal, thank you gentlemen very much for speaking with Mirror Now and sharing your perspective on this big annual climate conference that happens every year. All right, with that, it's a wrap on Beyond the Headline. News and updates will continue on Mirror Now. Thank you very much for joining us right now. Bye-bye. Good night.